know that only 31% of you guys are subscribed that watch my videos? Only 31%! That's unacceptable. That shit's unacceptable. I'm sorry. Like the video, subscribe. Please. I want it. Please. Alright, back to the video. Alright. Hi. How's it going, folks? Corner with a K here. Hope y'all are doing okay. And today, what are we doing today? We are ranking just Zelda things in general. We have 2 weeks until Tears of the Kingdom. It's my most anticipated game of the year. It's probably my most anticipated game of the decade. I'm going to get that out of the way right now. Probably my most anticipated game of the decade. We're going to start by ranking all the 3D dungeons, because I have actually played every 3D Zelda game, and thus I can, rank them all. And man, there's a lot of dungeons. But, it's going to be pretty quick. I'm not going to show, any gameplay, because I don't have that time to edit all of that. Alright, well, let's start from the top with Great Decatry. It's a pretty great starting dungeon. Just in general, it's probably the best starting dungeon out of any Zelda game. It teaches you all the foundations, especially for entering the world of 3D Zelda, which is so vastly different from 2D Zelda, that I think it just kind of has to go in an A tier just because of what it is. The Ancient Cistern. Fuck, that's a really good one, too. Skyward Sword has a pretty memorable slew of dungeons. Basically, every dungeon in that game, I think, is pretty memorable. Even if I think the game itself is kind of whatever. I think this one's going to be going in S tier. Like I said, it's a very fun and easy dungeon to kind of, grasp. It's a fun, unique dungeon, and it's a water dungeon that's, actually good. Something that very few other dungeons really get the hang of. Hyrule Castle from Breath of the Wild. This is a really fucking good dungeon. It just has so many little nuances with it. I'll talk more about it whenever I do. I'll talk more about it for a plan of attack whenever I do the Eventide challenge for it. But, honestly, it's probably another A tier dungeon. It's a really, really solid dungeon with just a bunch of little, things that you can find. There's a goddamn shrine in there, guys. There's Korok seeds out the wazoo. The Hylian shield's hidden in there. You get so many cool fights. And then, the boss fights itself is, whatever. So it's a pretty good thing. I haven't been judging them based off their bosses, but again, Koloktos is again iconic, so he's just S tier with Goma being just a great starting boss fight. Dodongo's Cavern. This is probably a C tier dungeon. It's a fun dungeon. I do enjoy blowing everything up with it, but it's just kind of there, It's a very boring dungeon. You're looking at a lot of the same things over and over again. And the boss is just such a pathetic boss fight. It really is not a fun boss fight. The Fire Temple is actually my favorite dungeon in Ocarina of Time. So it's going to be A tier. I do love the Fire Temple. I love the whole gimmick of it. And I love the Gorons. Again, they're my favorite race in Zelda, but this is a really, really fun just dungeon in general. I know, not everybody likes finding all the keys for it, but I like it. I like the hammer, too. It's probably my favorite weapon to use in that game. So, yeah, we'll give it an A tier. Is that the Fire Sanctuary? It's the Fire Sanctuary. So this is Skyward Sword's second to last dungeon. As a dungeon, it's kind of whatever, honestly. I don't remember a lot of it. I also have not played Skyward Sword in forever. I do know that you get the upgraded digging mitts. I'm going to put it in B tier for now. But, as a dungeon itself, it's kind of whatever. I do remember that the boss is Girahim, right? It's a pretty cool boss. Just because every Girahim fight is memorable in their own unique way. Goron Mines. It's got probably the most unique gimmick out of all the fire dungeons. Using the iron boots to magnetize yourself to the ceiling and to walk across things is really, really unique. However, because you're using the iron boots all the time, you hear a bunch of clanging, and it gets a little annoying. And then Pyrus is just kind of whatever as a boss. I'll put it in B tier too. Again, it's a unique dungeon. It's probably the most unique of the fire dungeons we have. Yeah. The Palace of Twilight. This is the second to last dungeon of Twilight Princess, and we're really now getting into the Twilight Princess dungeons, which probably have the best dungeon designs. Um, Straight up, this is probably an A tier dungeon. No, it's a B tier. The Xantans are a little wonky. Um, the Xantans are a little wonky, and thus getting those all out of the way is just not fun. And then we also have just a few things that just feel a little off to me, in my opinion. The fight against Zant is phenomenal, but like the whole palace itself, the Twilight Palace just seems a little meh at the end of the day. I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion, but I feel like this dungeon just does not get a lot of talk about it. Temple of Time. This was a fun dungeon. I remember having a lot of fun with it. At least my most recent playthrough of it. But that's also because I was probably getting that. That's also because I was getting aggravated with Ieta at that point, and so I was like, I need to take a quick break. It's a pretty fun dungeon. I like the use of the Dominion Rod, and of course the Dark Knight fight is just iconic. It's probably an A tier dungeon. It's probably not the best dungeon in Twilight Princess. I think I prefer it over the Fire Temple. Definitely prefer it over the Fire Temple, actually. Gomez, Armagoma's kind of what holds it back from being an S, I think. Hyrule Castle, Twilight Princess Edition. This is probably also another A tier dungeon. Like I said, Twilight Princess probably has the most solid set of dungeons. I think I prefer it over all of these. Again, it's a really unique, it's a unique twist where you have to basically find everything. Um, and it's not like the previous three Zelda games where your final dungeon was just kind of rehashes of the previous dungeons. It was literally like a brand new dungeon, and it felt like a breath of fresh air because of that. And then the fight against Ganon itself is obviously one of the most iconic fights. Obviously, having that sword duel at the end, that sword fight at the end is such a fucking fantastic battle if you don't use the fishing rod. But if you use the fishing rod, it's such a cheap, easy way to win. But like all of them, every single one of the phases of the fights are pretty easy and pretty fun to mess around with. Rudania. I literally just did this dungeon. This is probably the most fresh dungeon in my head. It is so bad. I like actually forgot how terrible of a dungeon this is. I hated the escort. I'm gonna count whatever task you have to do to enter Rudania as part of this, or to enter the Divine Beast as part of this. So that whole shit with the fucking that whole shtick with having to guide you Nobo all the way through. I found like the pretty easy way to cheese it was just to use was just to go ahead, let him stay by the cannon, and then just get rid of everything, and then work your way back over to him and walk all the way back over. That was so fucking boring, though. Like, literally both times I was bored. And then the boss itself, like, obviously the Blights are obviously just boring fights in general. But Fire Blight is such an easy boss fight, even in Master Mode. Like, as a side note, I died a lot during Water Blight Ganon's fight. Fire Blight Ganon's fight, I didn't die. And I'm playing on Master Mode with very limited armor. And I literally just, I beat the shit out of him. It's such an easy fight that it's just not worth, like, actually, like, talking about why it's such a boring fight. Oh, and also, it's a weird fire dungeon where it's, like, the worst of them all. Ganon's Castle from Ocarina of Time. This was the first This was the first 3D final dungeon. And it does one thing that a lot of the other final dungeons do, which is take aspects from previous dungeons and reuses them. So it takes all of the adult dungeons, and then also the Temple of Light, or the Temple of Time for some reason. And just kind of gives you this little gauntlet that you have to do. It is, I think, the only final dungeon to give you a dungeon item, though. It gives you the golden gauntlets, which are required to beat the game. Because you need it to actually access the Light Sage one, and then you also need it to access the, I think think you need it to access the final room. It's all right. It's probably the worst of the final dungeons so far. It's probably a B tier dungeon. This is by no means making it a bad fight. Bad thing. Obviously, the boss fight is iconic, tennis, and then the fight against Ganon himself is just, bro, it's the best final boss in the game. The bottom, is it the bottom of the well? It is the bottom of the well. Why the fuck is this here? It's an F tier dungeon. It's such an easy dungeon to go through, and the boss, if you really want to call it that, is Dead Hand, and Dead Hand is like actually not a hard fight. Um, it's a cool dungeon. I haven't played it in Master Quest, but I've heard that's like hell on earth. But like this dungeon can go fuck itself, dude, with how easy it is. Oh, Dragon Roost Cavern. It's weird having the first fire dungeon. Like, dude, we're just knocking all the fire dungeons out. We haven't gotten to a single water dungeon. Oh, we have. We have gotten the ancient cistern. That's weird. It's all right. It's a pretty fun dungeon. It's a good introductory dungeon. Not as good as the Great Deku Tree, I think, but certainly better than like other starting dungeons. Again, it's a fun dungeon, but like it's kind of forgettable at the end of the day. Like I kind of forget that it always exists, and then at the very end of it, the boss fight against Goma again. Goma's just such a weird boss in this game, and I don't know how I feel about it. I do like the grappling hook, and obviously that's like one of the highlights of it. And then also that you get inside and outside of the dungeon, which is very rare for a Zelda game, especially for a dungeon. At least up until Breath of the Wild, where all four divine beasts like have you explore outs like the outer walls of the dungeon, if that makes sense. Jabu's belly. I like the fight against Baronade. It's one of my favorite fights in the game. It's my favorite Young Link fight by far. But like aside from that, like, it's definitely the worst of the. It's definitely the worst of the Child Link dungeons, aside from the bottom of the well, which is a whole other beast entirely. It's fine. It does its job, but it's so middling at the end of the day, and it probably is the worst like actual dungeon that gets you a heart piece. Um, but yeah, I'm keeping up with the Ocarina of Time theme. We got the Spirit Temple. This is probably the most unique dungeon of them all. Using both Young Link and Adult Link to like get your way through this palace. It's not a. It's fine. But at the end of the day, it's fine. Just because it only does, you'll do one half and then you do the other half. That's how it goes. I do like all the Iron Knuckle fights with it. The fact that you have to fight one with Young Link and then you immediately fight one with Adult Link right after, and you just kind of realize, oh, there's a huge difference. You're never realizing how big of a difference it really is. I do love the Iron Knuckle boss fights. They're probably my favorite mini bosses in the game, aside from one. We'll talk about him later on because it's not quite there yet. But it's a fun dungeon. It's strange how it's like set up because it's. I kind of wish there was a way you could rewind time in the dungeon instead of having to leave the dungeon and then come back, because of the way it's set up. Again, as a dungeon itself, it's fine. It does its job perfectly, and it's kind of the best culmination that we could have asked for. But I think there could have been a unique way of like actually turning back and forth between Child Link and Adult Link instead of just having one whole side done by Adult Link and then one half, and then the other half done by Child Link. But it's a cool dungeon, I guess. Oh my god. It's the Wind Temple. This is a bad dungeon. It's one of those long tower dungeons that just always kind of get overshadowed by everything. And honestly, like, the tower dungeons are, like, always the worst dungeons. The long, just, like, single spiraled tower dungeons are not fun dungeons. The reason the Ancient Cistern worked so well is because it was like so unique. But the Wind Temple, it's whatever. You get the hook shot with it, and that's fun. But like otherwise, I don't think that this is like a very well designed dungeon. Um, oh, Arbiter's Grounds. This is an S tier dungeon, straight up. Probably the best dungeon in Twilight Princess. Might actually be the greatest dungeon of all time. There's a lot of things that it has going for it. Obviously, the boss fight is iconic. That sword is again just another really cool mini boss. Tracking down the four postals to like actually light up your way and have that nice callback to Ocarina of Time is really cool as well. Um, and then just like as a dungeon in general, it's a very unsettling dungeon with very that is just so very much like why can you just like not do anything with it? Plus, like you get like the spinner, and while like it is basically useless outside of the dungeon, it is oh my god the absolute best thing in that dungeon. Woodfall. Um, Woodfall is for a first dungeon, it's probably the actual best first dungeon. But in terms of like an actual like first dungeon to like a Zelda game, it's pretty hard. It's honestly the time limit itself doesn't make it too bad. You could probably you can finish this in like the first half of a day. Um, Pretty easily. It's a fun dungeon. It's fine enough as is. I'd probably rank it lower than the Great Deku Tree, but like it's such a but it's actually a fun dungeon with a lot of unique things that you got to get through, and of course it's the first dungeon that gives you your bow. um yeah. Hyrule, it's not Hyrule Castle, what's it called, the final palette, the final dungeon in Wind Waker. It exists. It's the gauntlet, again, and it's just not done as well as it was in Ocarina of Time. It's probably a D tier dungeon. It's boring. It's kind of bland. It doesn't have a lot going for it, and uh, like aside from the fight against Ganondorf, and Puppet Ganon, there's like no good aspects of this fight of this dungeon. Speaking of final dungeons that are kind of middling, aside from their final boss, the moon is a interesting dungeon. Obviously, it's surreal that like it even exists. Um, we'll put it in C tier. It's because it really does only have four dungeons. This fifth dungeon really does need to try and carry as hard as it can, and it doesn't do it as often as you think it would. Um, oh, we're at the infamous one now. We're at the infamous Water Temple, and I'm gonna be straight up with you. I actually fucking love the Water Temple. It's an A tier dungeon in my opinion. Absolutely a phenomenal dungeon. Coolest mini boss, a pretty fun final boss of the dungeon, and then just like in general, I think it's way more overhated. Obviously, I played it on the 3DS, so like all my hate towards it like kind of got mitigated. Um, but I got bored to a point where I'm like, now I beat that game. I beat that palace, that dungeon without grabbing the map or the compass. Like it's not as bad as everybody says it is. Um, it really is not as bad as everybody says it is, and I do love the palace, the dungeon itself. City in the Sky. This one's pretty fresh in my mind too because it was a dungeon I did pretty recently, back in August. It's fine. It does its job pretty well at the end of the day. The double claw shot is obviously the highlight of the dungeon, and once you get it, you're just kind of you become Spider-Man. As a dungeon itself, it's probably a B tier dungeon. It's probably the worst dungeon, probably one of the worst dungeons TP has for it. But yeah. You know, the fucking final dungeon of Skyward Sword. Skykeep, that's what it's called. It's just like every other final dungeon in Zelda, where it fucking takes just aspects from the other dungeons, and just makes it better. This one is actually like pretty cool though, because like you get to rearrange the rooms to find the pieces of the Triforce, and that's pretty unique at least. So I'll put it higher up than usual than I would put the other ones, but again, it's just kind of whatever. The Earth Temple. As a dungeon itself, it's fine. It does its job very well. It's being the very foreboding, haunted place. for the area. It's fine. It's probably Wind Waker's best dungeon, but at the end of the day, it's probably still just a B tier dungeon. Um, okay, so fuck Great Bay. As a dungeon, it's fine. It does its job, what it's supposed to be, the annoying ass water temple. Um, I would argue this is 50 times more annoying. And again, I played this first on the 3DS version, and oh my god, the nerfs that the 3DS version does to everything just pissed me off to no end. So it's alright. Again, it does its job of what it wants to do, but it does not do it very well. Um, it's a D tier dungeon. And I think really what's holding it back, and I think another thing that really holds it back is that its boss fight is just the worst in the game. Anybody who says that fight is the best fight in the game is so wrong. It really is wrong. The Forest Temple, Twilight Princess Edition. This is a fine enough dungeon. It's probably a B tier dungeon. I think out of all of the, like, if I'm putting, like, all the starting dungeons here, it's probably better than Woodfall, actually. It's definitely worse than the Great Deku Tree. Just because the Great Deku Tree really does just show you every little bit of the ropes, and it helps you, like, it basically teaches you every little gimmick that you would need to know for any point in the dungeon, in any dungeon going forward. But this one's fine. I like the monkeys bit, and I do like the fight against Ook the Baboon, but the boss fight is kind of whatever at the end of the day, I think. The Earth Temple, Skyward Sword Edition. I'm glad they have this. I haven't played or don't remember, because I remember you get bombs and the Scaldera fight, and that's about it. I don't remember a lot about this dungeon, and so I'm gonna just kind of hold my reserves for it for later. Va Meadow. This is probably the second best Divine Beast. It's probably the second worst Divine Beast, actually. It's a C tier dungeon. It's another one of the flying dungeons, but Va Meadow is super fucking easy. Like, I think aside from Rudania, this is the easiest dungeon in terms of both boss fights and just in terms of, like, what you have at your disposal. It's not very fresh in my mind. It's actually going to be more fresh later on. Actually, like, next week it would be fresh. I would probably think of it in a completely different sense, but at the time of, like, recording this, I just did Va Rudania's boss fight. Lakebed Temple. This was a lot more annoying than I remember it being. I remember my first playthrough of it not taking me too long. I think it took me, like, maybe an hour to get through, and then on my second playthrough, my most recent playthrough of Twilight Princess, this thing took me, like, an hour to get, took me, like, 3 hours to get through. Like, it was literally an entire stream dedicated to just trying to beat it. It was an annoying dungeon, too, at the same time. Trying to, like, remember where the water was gonna go, like, I was, like, consistently looking at my map, and it did not help that, like, everything there was just dull. As for, like, the boss fight itself, Morpheal is super boring, and, like, the mini-boss, like, I didn't even remember. I had to look up, like, how do I fight this thing? Because I forgot how to fight it. The tech lab, not the tech lab, the factory from Skyward Sword. This is the third dungeon in the game. This is the dungeon that you get the Gust Bellows in, and you fight Moldarok. Is the boss fight. I don't know how to feel about this dungeon. Honestly, I remember the time shift being super cool, so I'm gonna probably give them a B rank. Definitely better than most of Skyward Sword's dungeons, but Skyward Sword has some pretty stellar dungeons. Oh boy, Stone Tower Temple. I would be straight up with you. This is probably Majora's Mask's best dungeon, and it's an S tier dungeon. It takes what the Spirit Temple was supposed to do for Ocarina of Time and actually makes it work, and that's because the masks are items. because you can switch in between every form, they all get their actual light spotlight, and it helps create like this actual like good dungeon for what it is. It's a very fun dungeon and is without a doubt Majora's Mask's best dungeon. I think the worst part about it is the fucking final boss. Twin Mold is terrible, and that's in both versions. I'm well aware it's terrible in both versions, but it's really bad in the 3DS version. Fuck. The Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time. I, it's an S tier. Like, I know that I said the Fire Temple is my favorite dungeon, and it was probably for a long time. But like, as I like replay Zelda games, I think the Zelda game I was like the most excited to go back to was Ocarina of Time, and I just decided no, I can hold off on it for a bit because I don't want myself to get mad at this game. Because I have a lot of nostalgia towards this. This is what made me a Zelda fan to this day, and it's still to this day I think the greatest video game of all time. There's a difference between my favorite and the greatest. That's what I think is the greatest. But the Forest Temple as a dungeon, it literally does everything that it takes the concept of the Great Deku Tree being like this great introductory dungeon and just takes it all up a whole nother level. This is like phenomenal dungeon in terms of just every little gimmick. It's the dungeon where you get the bow. The hookshot is still well utilized here, and because those are your two most utilized items, they're never actually leaving your slots. They're far more useful that way, in my opinion. I personally use these things. I personally use like the bow and the hookshot all the time. They literally like never leave my slots. I have them equipped to my X and Y slots on my 3DS version, and I'll basically always have them equipped to my like my actual like button slots, my C buttons, in any other version I play of this game. But again, it's a unique dungeon. It's got some fun gimmicks with it. It's a fun. It's just a good dungeon in general. Forsaken, no, Forbidden Woods. Where's the Forsaken Fortress? Forsaken Fortress isn't on here. Forbidden Woods is whatever. It's kind of a. It's better than some of their dungeons, but it's probably the like most mid dungeon of Wind Waker. And Wind Waker already doesn't have a lot of dungeons, so it makes it very, very hard to talk about in terms of like what it has. Obviously the boomerang is cool, and Kalei Demos is a really, really fun boss fight, especially if you come in with like the insta kill thing. Fun fact, you can insta kill Kalei Demos if you go fast enough. But it's just boring most of the time. Like, yeah, you get to fuck around with the Deku Leaf, and that's fun. And the boomerang is obviously just like a hella awesome tool that you will consistently use throughout the rest of your journey. But as a dungeon itself, it's whatever. I think it's a fine enough dungeon. It's very fresh in my mind because I played it pretty recently. But yeah, the sand ship. Oh, dude, the sand ship has like one of the coolest like concepts. Again, the time shift stones from Skyward Sword are some of the coolest fucking concepts ever. It's a shame that both fucking dungeons don't use it for their final boss. Again, it's probably like better than the factory. Is it the Lanayru Factory? Is that what it's called? I think it's the Lanayru Factory. I could be wrong. But yeah, I think it's a fine I think it's a good dungeon. It has a lot of those redeeming qualities. It's just the fucking. I just wish they used the time shift stones more, bro. Like for the bosses of those dungeons, especially so, bro. Like it really is just like the worst bit of it. The Shadow Temple, I don't think I need to really talk about why it's an iconic dungeon. Again, it's like. Honestly, I'm probably moving the Fire Temple down a peg nowadays. I just don't think it's as good as it used to be. But the Shadow Temple is iconic as a dungeon, bro. It's so cool. Fight against Dudham, fight against Bongo Bongo, Stalfos at the wazoo. It's such a fun dungeon to do. It has a lot of puzzles that like it, dude. It's so fun. The hover boots uh, are a cool item that get underused, of course. Go figure. It's every fucking Zelda item at this point. Um, but yeah, it's a fun dungeon that uses like basically everything you have at your disposal. It's actually the one time you will actually use Dinge Fire for shit, and it's super fun because of that. Um, but yeah, it's a cool dungeon. Um, the Skyview Temple. That's what it's called, Skyview Temple from Skyward Sword. This is their first dungeon. I do know that the Beetle is a. I do remember this one actually pretty because I did play it relatively recently. It's a fine enough dungeon. It's better than most of Skyward Sword's dungeons. Not like by a lot, but like it's probably better than. Yeah. But it's a fun dungeon. It has a lot of the cool gimmicks that you would have. Your first boss fight against Girahim is obviously iconic for it. You get your first fight against the Stalfos too. It's a big callback to Ocarina of Time in that sense, where you fight Stalfos to get your dungeon item, and then you get the Beetle, which is just a fun item to fuck around with. Um, it's also the only dungeon where you actually return to it to grab something that's like necessary for the plot. Like you can technically return to all of the Child Link dungeons, and you do need it if you want to collect all the Skulltulas, but why the fuck would you collect all the Skulltulas? Okay. Snow Head? I think it's what it's called. Snow Head? One is Snow Head, one is Snow Peak, and then, like, I get Snow Point messed up in there, too, because they're all, like, northernmost points of maps of games I like. It's fine. It's the Goron dungeon. It's a fun Goron dungeon, but with like a cool boss fight. Goat probably carries. Honestly, if I'm being straight up, I think Goat single-handedly carries this up to like an A tier dungeon. Not high A. It's definitely worse than the Water Temple, but Goat itself just kind of carries that dungeon super hard. Without a doubt, the best boss fight in the game. And it has a lot of the fun things with it, the fun gimmicks with it. The fire arrows are obviously nice, and it's nice that they actually get a lot more use because of it. But yeah, Snow Peak Ruins. This is a fun dungeon. It's the generic ice dungeon of this game, and I think this is like the first one where we like legitimately get an ice dungeon. Um, It's fine. It does its job. The ball and chain is obviously a fun weapon, and then the Blizzetta fight is a fun fight. There's a lot of just bullshit though that I've noticed. Like all the fucking freeze enemies can go fuck themselves. Freeze is such an annoying gimmick in basically every video game, and like it just takes it to a whole other level. And the Tower of the Gods. Oh god. Okay, so straight up, the Tower of the Gods is such a weird dungeon. It's technically their water dungeon. It's technically the water dungeon of this game. Technically. But in the game, where you have 90% of the sea, you can't dive underneath it. Why? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. It's not a D tier. I'm not going to be that petty with it, because it's definitely better than both of these dungeons. It's probably high C. It's probably the high C tier dungeon for this game. And with that being said, we're left off with the last two, and those are Divine Beasts. Vah Ruta is pretty fresh in my mind, so I'll save that one for last. We'll do Vanaboris first. This dungeon is a hard dungeon. It's probably the best dungeon just because it actually does test your puzzle solving skills in this game. Is it better than Hyrule Castle? Absolutely not, but it does test your puzzle solving skills quite a bit. It's definitely the worst of the A tier dungeons, but it's still a fun dungeon. And then finally, Vah Ruta is the second most fresh dungeon in my mind. I did it like 2 days ago. It's a pretty fun dungeon. I like having the ability. I like how this is how you control the water. It's like a whole combination of like all other water dungeons kind of just culminating into this one dungeon, except it doesn't hit like those high highs or those low lows. if that makes sense. It's a fun dungeon with the like probably one of the most mid fights if you're playing it on regular mode. But if you're playing it on master mode, it's like the worst fight in the game because I don't know why I don't like Water Blight, but he just fucking every time I fight him, he just gives me a hard time on master mode. I should have mentioned Thunderblight Ganon is also just the best Blight Ganon. It's the boss fight I feel that teaches you either A, how to parry the best, or B, how to flurry rush. Like, that is exactly what I feel that fight does, is it teaches you. It's the best fight to teach you either A, how to flurry rush, or B, how to fucking parry. I always use it for my flurry rush practice. It's a fun fight to practice the flurry rushes with. But there are other things that you can do to practice both of those. But yeah, so this is the list. If I ever decide to stream Skyward Sword, which I think I will, which I do plan on doing eventually, I'll talk more. I'll probably reevaluate myself with the Earth Temple. But for now, this is what I think of every Zelda game, or every 3D Zelda dungeon. As of right now. As of right now. As of the release of this week's video, which is 2 weeks from now, we will have Tears of the Kingdom, which might change everything. Who the fuck knows, bro? Who the fuck knows? But with all that being said, I hope you all have a fantastic night, and take care.